This video is all about separating mixtures, and I'm going to go through the different ways to separate mixtures, and then you're going to be doing a lab with a few of these different ways. Okay, so we're going to start off with just a little bit about the different ways to separate mixtures. And what you want to keep in mind when you are separating a mixture is that you are physically separating the mixture into its pure substances. You are not chemically changing anything. Okay, these are all physical changes. You're just separating the mixture into its pieces. You're not actually changing what it is. So just keep that in mind here. And we're going to look at a bunch of different ways to separate mixtures based on what is in the mixture. So we're going to have to look at the different properties. Okay, the first one is filtration, and you have done this one before. Okay, filtration is probably the best way to separate according to solubility and size. When you look at filtration, you're going to have one that dissolves in the solvent and the one that doesn't. Remember, solvent is the liquid that is in the larger amount that does the dissolving. Okay, there are kind of two parts to filtration, and we mentioned these words way at the beginning of the year. Okay, what's called a filtrate, and that is the liquid that passes through the filter paper. And you also have the residue, which is just what it sounds like, it's the solid particles that remain. And we have done this kind of filtration before, so that should be nothing new. Moving on to evaporation and crystallization, these usually go right along with filtration. Where you are evaporating something, you are separating the soluble solid from a liquid. So here you're going to have something that is already dissolved in the solvent, and you need to undissolve it. And how this works, and you've done this before, is that the heat evaporates the solvent and leaves behind the solid residue or the crystals. And as you can see there in the picture, you have the evaporating dish, which is the most common item to do this in. And you'll leave usually the salt or the sugar or whatever was once soluble now behind in its solid form once you get rid of the liquid, which is usually water. And then the crystallization is usually the end point of that, where you are then crystallizing or leaving the crystals behind. You can also recrystallize something by just cooling it down a lot of times with mixtures, and we'll look more at that at another point in the year. Okay, the next type is decanting. Decanting is probably the easiest way to separate a liquid from an insoluble solid. We did this when you did the same kind of step with the filtration. This is usually a little rougher method than a filtration with a filter paper. Usually you have some stuff left behind with the solid. Usually leave a little bit of liquid there, so it depends on how much you really need to get all of that liquid out or not, as to whether decanting is a good idea. You can also separate two immiscible liquids with decanting, but again, you're going to end up, it's not the neatest way to separate. These are often used for suspensions because you have something that settles out over time. You're trying to get the water out and leave behind the mud that's part of like the muddy river water. Okay, a new one is centrifuging. Okay, if you are centrifuging, that means that you are separating fine particles from an insoluble solid. Okay, so you're going to have a solution with some particles floating around in it, and they're usually going to be very, very fine particles. Something that really wouldn't work very well with filtration or decanting. The particles would end up kind of just going with the liquid that you don't want. So this will separate out fine things. Okay, centrifuging is where you have the glass tubes that are of equal amounts, and they spin around in a circle. So you put your mixture into the test tube, and you have to have equal amounts so it doesn't get unbalanced. So you have this test tube and the one exactly across from it filled, and then you turn it on and they'll spin around in a circle. And as they spin around in a circle, then what happens is your solid ends up on the bottom and your liquid ends up towards the top, and then you can just kind of decant or pour off or pipette out the top portion of the liquid. Alright, centrifuging. So then we have distillation. Okay, distillation is where you are separating two liquids according to their boiling points. Okay, this is where your mixture is heated and your lower boiling point evaporates off and is then collected in a receiving flask. Then what happens is the distillate moves to that receiving flask. And so the stuff that you are collecting is called the distillate. Okay, then the residue stays behind in the original flask. The water then in the condenser in the middle cools off the distillate as it kind of makes its way down. So as you see in the picture here, we have our two liquids that we are heating, okay? And the liquid then that has a lower boiling point boils first, so it evaporates. Well, then it evaporates, it runs down this tube. We've got water surrounding the tube here, so that cool water immediately cools down that gas. So instead of having a gas, now when it gets collected, it's now in a liquid form. Hence, it's called a condenser. If you condense something, that means you're going from a gas to a liquid. This is a very common way to try and collect drinking water from seawater. Alright, the next one is magnetism. Magnetism is where you separate iron from a mixture. It's usually used to recover iron from other kinds of domestic waste. Most magnets are iron. Not all metals are magnetic. There are only certain ones. You have what are called alnico magnets, which are aluminum, nickel, and cobalt. You have neodymium magnets. You can have samarium magnets, but not every single metal is a magnet and can be separated by using a magnet. The last way to separate is chromatography. Chromatography has many different types. Okay, the most common type is a paper chromatography, but you can also have gas chromatographs and thin layer chromatography, which is TLC. When you look at a paper chromatography, there are two phases, and we'll look more at this at the end of the year. You have a stationary phase, which is the paper, and you have a mobile phase, which is the solvent. And what happens is here that parts of your mixture get carried up the paper to differing heights, and you can see the different compounds. So a lot of times you do see this with inks. You'll have one ink at the bottom, you'll dip it in a solvent, and the solvent will run up the paper and will separate these solvent into different colors. And they are identified by how far they move.
Access slips every day with the group that didn't get it.